The F-22 Raptor is back on camera, topping off fuel from a KC-135 somewhere over the Middle East, and CENTCOM didn't have to say much else because everyone watching already knows what that jet has been doing for the last 5.5 months. It's August 17th, 2026. Hope everybody's doing well wherever you're tuned in from. And here's what's actually happened since the last time we talked about this war. Iran said there were no talks with the United States. Then there were talks. Then there was a draft agreement with Oman that got described as close. Then the ink never quite dried. And now we're right back to tankers getting hit in the Strait of Hormuz and the President of the United States talking about annexing the entire waterway on a stage in New York. So basically, Iran did the exact same dance it's been doing since March. Deny, negotiate quietly, get caught negotiating, deny some more, and somehow still end up worse off than when it started. Before we get into it, if you're new here, subscribe. It's free. It helps way more than you'd think. Drop a like on your way out, turn the notification bell on, because with a story moving this fast, you do not want to be a day behind. And let me know in the comments which thread you want me to go deeper on next, because I actually read what you guys write and it shapes what gets covered. Here's the rundown for today. We're going deep on the F-22 again because there's a reason CENTCOM keeps putting this specific jet on camera, and it's not just for the highlight reel. We've got the aftermath of Trump's Oval Office decapitation line, and what happened to that so-called last chance in the 2 weeks since he said it. We've got the new Qatar and Iranian pilot standoff, which honestly might be the wildest subplot of this entire war right now. We've got a full global roundup because China, Turkey, and a Russian sanctions buster all had a moment worth talking about. And then we close with a strategic read, the part of the video where I connect the dots nobody else on this platform is bothering to connect. So let's start with the Raptor, because it earns the top slot every single time it shows up on screen. This is the jet that kicked in Iran's front door on March 1st, the opening night of Operation Epic Fury, when a package of F-22s went in ahead of everything else and suppressed Iran's S-300 batteries and its homegrown Bavar 373 system, the exact system Tehran spent years marketing as the answer to American stealth. Corridors got cut open, and everything that came in behind those Raptors, the B-2s, the strike packages hitting Fordo and Natanz, walked through doors the Raptor kicked down first. Over that opening 9-day campaign, Iran fired dozens of surface-to-air missiles trying to find something in the sky. And by CENTCOM's own account, not one of them ever successfully tracked or locked onto an F-22. 5.5 months later, an Iranian radar still hasn't figured it out, which is either extremely embarrassing or extremely telling, depending on how generous you're feeling toward Tehran today. Now here's the part people miss about this jet, because everyone assumes the Raptor is purely an air-to-air platform, a dogfighter, and that's not the full picture. It carries GBU-39 small-diameter bombs and GBU-32 JDAMs internally, tucked inside the airframe, because the second you hang ordnance externally on a pylon, you've created a radar reflector, and you've compromised the exact stealth signature the entire jet exists to protect. That's why during the original strikes on Fordo and Natanz infrastructure, Raptors were flying with weapons bays closed until the moment they needed to open, working in layered packages alongside EA-18G Growlers, jamming enemy radar frequencies, and B-2s doing the heavy lifting on the deepest targets. Iranian radar operators were quite literally hunting for something they couldn't see, while a jammer sat parked on the exact frequency they needed. And none of that works without gas. The KC-135 Stratotanker is a 6-decade-old airframe, and it is still the single piece of equipment quietly making 5th-generation stealth possible across a theater this large, because a Raptor's combat radius means nothing if it can't loiter, reposition, and come back for another pass without landing at a forward base that puts it at risk. Air Force refueling crews have talked about how demanding that mid-air hookup actually is in real combat conditions, turbulence, time pressure, needing to get back in the fight fast, and it is genuinely one of the more underrated skill sets in the entire operation. 186 of these jets were ever built. Production shut down back in 2011 because at the time, nobody thought there was an adversary left on Earth worth building more of them for. 15 years later, and the Raptor has been used over Syria, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and now Iran, which is a pretty remarkable rebuttal to whoever made that original production call. And CENTCOM keeps putting this exact jet on camera for a reason, because every time Iran ramps up drone launches against Gulf partners, and they have been ramping up drone launches against Gulf partners, the radar suite on that F-22 becomes one of the primary tools tracking and queuing intercepts against them almost the instant they leave the launch rail. Let's talk specs for a second, because I think people underrate just how much of an engineering outlier this jet still is more than 20 years after it entered service. Twin Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines with thrust vectoring nozzles, which means the jet can point thrust up and down independently of where the nose is pointed, giving it a maneuverability envelope that even modern 4th-generation fighters simply cannot replicate. It's also got a thrust-to-weight ratio that sits right around 1-to-1 at typical combat weight and full military power, and climbs past 1-to-1 in full afterburner, which in plain English means this jet can accelerate straight up. Supercruise is the other piece people gloss over, the ability to sustain supersonic speed without ever dropping into max afterburner, which sounds like a small detail until you realize what it actually buys you operationally. It means the jet burns dramatically less fuel getting to and staying at supersonic speeds. It means a smaller infrared signature because you're not dumping raw fuel through the exhaust the way you do in max afterburner. And it means the Raptor can cover enormous amounts of ground fast while staying harder to detect the entire time. Some people hear that and think max afterburner must just be some flashy feature nobody actually needs. And no, that's backwards. Supercruise is the feature. Afterburner is the blunt instrument you save for when you need every ounce of thrust immediately and don't care who's watching. So if the decapitation campaign that Trump has been threatening actually restarts, and we'll get into that threat in a second, the Raptor isn't just escorting anybody. It is very likely the first jet back in, doing precision work against IRGC leadership and command infrastructure the same way it did on night one. Now let's talk about that decapitation line, because 2 weeks ago this was the biggest headline in the entire war, and I want to walk you through what's actually happened since. Standing in the Oval Office on August 3rd, Trump told reporters he wanted to give Iran every last chance before decapitation, a word he used completely literally, not as some vague metaphor, while reiterating a threat to launch what he described as the biggest attack since World War II. He said the talks were happening at the request of Iran, and separately at the request of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, who had apparently all called in trying to buy Tehran a bit more runway. Same day, Iran's foreign ministry publicly denied any negotiations were taking place at all, which set Trump off on Truth Social, where he called Iranian leadership unbelievably duplicitous, mocked what he called their usual blather about controlling the strait when the American blockade already had it locked down, and said flatly that Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Iran being duplicitous, groundbreaking stuff, truly a shocking development from the regime that spent decades telling its own citizens one thing while doing another behind closed doors. Somebody give the mullahs a participation trophy for consistency, I guess. So here's what happened with that last chance. Talks with Oman did progress, and by early August, reporting described a shipping corridor agreement as being in its final drafting stage. Technical, legal, security, and environmental details all being hammered out, supposedly pending a joint statement. But Iran's own spokespeople were very careful to say that even a deal with Oman wouldn't automatically mean the strait was safe for vessels, because in their framing, the real source of instability was the American naval blockade itself, not their own missile and drone attacks on commercial shipping, which is a pretty remarkable bit of blame reversal if you sit with it for a second. And then, as you probably already know if you've been watching this channel, that draft never actually translated into a durable reopening. Within days, you had fresh tanker strikes, a UAE vessel hit, then 2 more vessels linked to the same company hit in a single day. And by August 14th, Trump was on a stage in New York saying that once Iran is, in his words, very badly defeated, he plans to declare the Strait of Hormuz a territory of the United States. So the 2-week last chance came and went. The draft deal with Oman apparently wasn't enough to actually stop the attacks. And we're right back to threats, except now the threats have shifted from decapitation strikes to outright territorial claims over an international waterway that runs along the coastline of a sovereign nation. Iran's deputy foreign minister fired back almost immediately, saying the strait cannot be taken by a tweet, an aircraft carrier, a decree, or a campaign speech. And honestly, legally speaking, he's not wrong, because the strait sits in Iranian and Omani territorial waters. And international law does not simply hand ownership of a strait to whichever navy currently has the biggest blockade sitting in it. But strategically, I think you have to read this as Trump keeping maximum pressure on the table in public, while the quieter diplomatic track with Oman keeps grinding away in private. Because those two things can absolutely run in parallel, and probably are running in parallel right now as we speak. And here's the part that I think gets lost in all the noise about tweets and territory claims. This is not the first time this exact cycle is played out. Back in April, Trump agreed to a 2-week ceasefire after Pakistan's prime minister and its top military commander personally asked him to hold off on what he described as a devastating strike, on the condition that Iran guaranteed complete and immediate safe passage through the strait. Iran agreed. Oil prices actually dropped double digits within hours of that announcement, and for about a week, it looked like the war might genuinely be winding down. Then Iran was, in Trump's own words, doing a very poor job of actually reopening the strait. Israel and Hezbollah started trading strikes in Lebanon again, Kuwait got hit with drones, and the whole fragile framework fell apart within days. A few weeks after that came the Islamabad talks, 21 hours of negotiation across 3 separate rounds, where both sides reportedly got extremely close to a 10-point ceasefire framework but still couldn't close the gap on exactly two issues: the Strait of Hormuz and the nuclear program, which, if you're keeping score, are the exact same two issues still unresolved right now in mid-August. So when you hear about this current Oman-brokered draft supposedly being in its final stage, pending some joint statement, I'd encourage you to remember we have now watched this movie at least 3 separate times since the war started. The deal gets close, oil markets breathe a sigh of relief, and then it falls apart over the exact same 2 sticking points, because neither side is actually willing to move on the fundamentals. Iran will not accept an American military presence remaining in the Gulf as the price of reopening its own waterway. And the United States will not accept anything short of a fully denuclearized Iran as the price of lifting the blockade. And until one of those two positions actually bends, you can expect this same cycle of almost deals and collapsed ceasefires to keep repeating itself roughly every few weeks. Add in the fact that Iran's own economy is buckling under the weight of sanctions targeting well over 1,000 individuals and entities at this point, and you start to understand why Tehran keeps agreeing to sit down at the table, only to walk right back out of the room a few days later. They genuinely need the relief that a real deal would bring: the oil revenue, the reopened banking channels, the eased pressure on a currency that's been in freefall. But agreeing to the terms Washington is actually asking for would mean accepting a level of military and nuclear constraint that the regime has spent 40 years insisting it would never accept. And that contradiction is exactly why these negotiations keep collapsing at the finish line instead of the starting line. Now, the story I actually think is the wildest development of the entire week. And I want you to stick with me here because it's a genuine mystery with two governments telling completely opposite versions of events. You'll remember that back in early March, right at the start of the war, Qatar's Air Force shot down 2 Iranian Su-24 fighter bombers that were allegedly headed toward Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the region and a major CENTCOM hub. That was the first air-to-air kill in Qatari Emiri Air Force history. For months, the fate of the crew was murky. Iran eventually confirmed one pilot, Majid Kazemi, had died and his body was returned, but the other 3 simply disappeared into the fog of war with no official word either way. This past weekend, a senior Iranian military official sent a formal letter to the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, claiming that 3 pilots, named as Javad Salehi, Abdulmajid Dashtian, and Omran Behraveshian, were actually captured alive by Qatari forces and have been held for 6 months, denied contact with their families, with Iranian officials, and even with each other. Iran is framing this explicitly as a prisoner of war situation and is demanding the Red Cross get access to confirm their condition. And then, almost immediately, Qatar came out and categorically denied the entire thing. Qatar's foreign ministry said they were surprised these claims were surfacing at this exact moment, especially given active diplomatic efforts underway to de-escalate regional tensions. And honestly, that timing question is a fair one to raise. According to Doha's version, their air defenses detected the jets violating Qatari airspace, tried repeatedly to make contact and warn them off, got no response, and only then took action to defend their territory under international law. Qatar says search and rescue teams went out afterward, specifically looking for remains, recovered the body of one pilot, and coordinated with Iran to hand that body back, which lines up with the Kazemi story we already knew about. But Doha is flatly rejecting the claim that 3 living pilots are sitting in Qatari custody. And they even say they invited an Iranian delegation back in April to review the details of the recovery operation, and that Tehran never bothered to respond to that invitation. So now you've got Iran saying 3 of their men are alive and being held incommunicado in violation of the Geneva Conventions, and Qatar saying there is nothing to hide because all 4 pilots are accounted for as killed except for the incomplete remains situation that's already been resolved. Somebody is lying here, or at minimum somebody is badly mischaracterizing what actually happened. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this claim from Iran surfaced right as broader ceasefire diplomacy is supposedly gaining momentum. If you're the Iranian regime and you need a domestic narrative that doesn't involve admitting 3 more pilots died in a failed strike on Qatar, alive prisoners of war held by a duplicitous Gulf state is a much better story to tell your own population than dead pilots killed in a mission that never even reached its target. On the other hand, if you're Qatar, trying to position yourself as the honest broker holding peace talks together, the last thing you want is to be publicly accused of running a secret detention operation against a country you're simultaneously trying to help negotiate a truce for. So let me know down in the comments which version you actually believe, because I think this is going to be one of the more consequential info fights of the whole war if it turns out those 3 men really are sitting somewhere with real intelligence value about Iranian Air Force tactics. And think about what those pilots could actually offer if they are alive and cooperating with whoever is holding them, low-altitude penetration routes into a Gulf state's airspace, radar blind spots the Iranian Air Force believed it had identified, targeting procedures for a strike against a major American base, and real operational insight into how Iranian air crews are trained to handle a mission that goes sideways. That's an enormous intelligence prize for whoever actually has custody of these men, which is exactly why I don't think either government's public story is the complete picture. Because both Tehran and Doha have obvious incentives to control the narrative regardless of what's actually happening behind closed doors. Now let's move into the global roundup, because there's a lot happening outside the immediate Iran theater that connects back to the bigger picture, and I promise it does connect, so stick with me. First up, China. Beijing surged an amphibious group and maritime strike bombers to Scarborough Shoal. That's the contested reef about 120 nautical miles off the Philippines that both countries claim. The formation included a Type ZIS-5-2D guided missile destroyer, a Type 071 landing platform dock, a frigate, a corvette, and overhead at least 2 H-6K bombers configured for maritime strike carrying YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, escorted by a KJ-500 airborne early warning aircraft, which is basically China's version of an AWACS. The PLA's Southern Theater Command called this safeguarding sovereignty. Everyone else watching the radar picture called it exactly what it looked like. A live rehearsal of the opening moves of a blockade, conducted with real warships and real anti-ship missiles instead of the usual Coast Guard water cannon theater we've gotten used to seeing out there. The Philippine military confirmed the drills happened. 5 warships, a replenishment ship, hovercraft, helicopters, and fighter aircraft all tracked over a 2-day window. It's worth remembering this is happening while a huge chunk of American naval and air power remains tied down supporting Iran operations halfway around the world, and I don't think that timing is lost on anybody in Beijing. And this is where I think the two theaters actually start talking to each other, whether anyone in Washington wants to admit it or not. Every carrier strike group, every squadron of tankers, every intelligence asset currently oriented toward the Gulf of Oman and the Strait of Hormuz is an asset that is not sitting in the Indo-Pacific. And China's military planners are not exactly known for missing an opportunity like that. 120 nautical miles off the Philippines is close enough to Manila that this reads less like a routine drill and more like a calculated test of how distracted Washington currently is, and how quickly, or how slowly, the United States could actually pivot meaningful assets back toward the Pacific if a real crisis broke out there while the Iran war is still consuming attention and resources. That's the kind of two-front pressure test that doesn't require firing a single shot to be effective. It just requires showing up with real warships and real anti-ship missiles at exactly the moment your rival's attention is somewhere else entirely. Next story, Turkey, and this one is a genuinely interesting hardware development if you're into this stuff like I am. Turkey's unmanned fighter program opened its internal weapons bay for the first time during testing and released a guided glide kit mounted on a 500-pound class bomb, hitting its target successfully. A few days later, it repeated the demonstration with a different penetrating glide bomb design. What makes this notable is that it's an air-to-ground oriented unmanned combat aircraft, releasing ordnance from inside its own fuselage, specifically to preserve a stealthier profile rather than hanging weapons externally the way most drones still do. Turkey has been aggressively pushing its domestic defense industry for years now, and this is exactly the kind of milestone that turns a flashy airshow prototype into an actual operational capability. And it's worth watching closely given how active Turkey has become across Syria and the broader region lately. Third story in the roundup, and this one is honestly the wildest visual of the week if you go looking for the footage. Italian Marines rappelled down onto the deck of a tanker in broad daylight and boarded it at sea. The vessel had switched its flag registration to Cameroon only about a week before the boarding, which is about as subtle as showing up to a job interview wearing a name tag that says, "Definitely not a spy." It's part of the exact pattern we've been seeing across Russia's sanctions, busting shadow fleet, ships quietly reflagging, changing ownership on paper, running dark on tracking systems, all in an effort to keep moving sanctioned oil around the world without getting intercepted. Getting boarded by NATO Marines in broad daylight is not exactly the discreet outcome that Shadow Fleet is designed to avoid. And it tells you European navies are getting a lot more aggressive about enforcement than they were even a few months ago. All right, now for the strategic read, the part where I want to connect these threads together, because I don't think anyone else covering this war is actually doing it. Iran wants to negotiate exclusively with Oman and keep the United States as far from the table as possible, at least publicly, because admitting direct engagement with Washington undermines the entire narrative they've built for their own population, the one where America is the villain and Iran is the resistant underdog standing firm. But here's the problem with that strategy. The single largest concentration of naval power on the planet is sitting directly in Iran's backyard in the Strait of Hormuz, enforcing a blockade that has still allowed a documented flow of legitimate shipping through under American terms, over 1,000 vessels and millions of barrels moved since the blockade went into effect, all happening on the U.S. Navy's schedule, not Iran's. That reality forces Tehran into exactly the position it hates most, needing a deal, needing the strait open, needing the economic pressure to ease, while simultaneously needing to tell its own people that none of this is happening because of American strength. It's happening because Iran chose to negotiate with a smaller neighbor out of the goodness of its heart. That's an incredibly difficult story to sell when your economy is being bled dry by sanctions, when you're telling your own citizens to cut back on electricity usage because the grid is strained, and when one of the most oil-rich countries on the planet somehow has its own population dealing with gas and oil shortages at home. So every time you see Iran deny talks are happening, every time you see them lean hard on the Oman-only framing, every time a new claim like this Qatar pilot situation surfaces, right as diplomacy appears to be gaining ground, I think you have to read it through that lens. A regime that is losing leverage militarily and economically, trying to manufacture leverage rhetorically and diplomatically instead, because that's genuinely the only lever they've got left to pull. Let me know what you think is actually being set up here in the comments, because I think we're heading toward another one of these on again, off again, ceasefire moments within the next few weeks, and I'd bet money it gets messy again before it gets resolved. That's the update for today. Make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell on so you catch the next one the moment it drops. Drop a comment with which story you want covered in more depth, and I will see you in the next video.